The ration depot stood at the edge of a damaged European town in the late winter of 1944. Its brick walls patched with wooden boards, and its yard fenced off with rope lines to keep order during weekly food collection. And on that cold afternoon, the line of civilians stretched all the way to the burned tram stop as people clutched ration sacks, metal ladles, and stamped slips that proved they were allowed to receive flour and dried vegetables before curfew. The depot whistles had already blown twice to warn that distribution was almost over for the day, and depot staff moved quickly, weighing flour on metal scales and tying bags shut while soldiers watched the road for military vehicles. A thin layer of snow covered the cobblestones, turning to slush under the boots of civilians who shifted their weight to stay warm, praying silently that their names were still on the list and their ration categories had not been reduced again. When the depot bell rang for the final time, workers shut the distribution window and told civilians to clear the yard so the shutters could be lowered before the evening alert system was tested. Most people rushed inside the gate to reach the shelter stairs before the air alert siren practice began, because officials had announced that the previous week's test had failed, and no one wanted to be caught outside if the real sirens followed. On the loading ramp near the back gate stood a woman in her mid-20s, wearing a patched coat and holding her ration sack with both hands, waiting for instructions as the last few civilians hurried past her without speaking. She did not have a home permit for any of the shelters inside the district, because her old building had been emptied for medical supplies, and her landlord had been relocated during a housing audit 2 weeks earlier. Without a registered address or sponsor, she belonged to the category that the Army called displaced civilian, which sounded official but meant very little when sirens started ringing. A depot guard shouted for everyone without shelter assignment to leave the yard, because the cellar space was reserved for those whose names were on the weekly sheets, and no one wanted an inspection report citing overcrowding. The woman tried to explain that she had nowhere to go, but the guard waved her toward the gate, saying there was no time to argue. The wind grew harsher as the bell clanged again, and civilians pushed through the door toward the basement stairs where a stove had already been lit for those legally inside. In the street outside the depot fence, market vendors rolled up tarps, parents pulled children by the sleeves, and a nurse shouted for patients from the outpatient line to move toward the clinic before the shutters came down. The woman stood frozen on the ramp, clutching her ration sack, unsure whether to run or wait for someone to tell her what to do. Then, without warning, the air alert siren began to howl in the distance, long, rising, mechanical, cutting through the wind like metal scraping against metal. And civilians reacted instantly, some breaking into a run, others hunched over their carts as they pushed toward any doorway that would permit entry. The depot shutters rattled as soldiers locked the side doors, and the woman knocked on the wooden panel, begging to be let in. But the depot officer shouted that without a shelter permit he could not open the door, because regulations required every civilian in the shelter to be logged on a roster in case the building was struck and needed rescue. The woman backed away from the door and looked up at the sky that was turning darker and darker, wondering how a person could survive a winter war in a town where safety required paperwork she did not have, while the siren continued to wail over a street that was running out of places for her to stand. The depot officer pulled the last door shut and slid the metal bar across the brackets, while repeating that only civilians with shelter permits could enter the basement during alerts, because every head in the shelter had to be counted for the weekly safety reports. And if the roster did not match the number of blankets issued, the depot could lose authorization to operate. The woman stood alone on the loading ramp, with her ration sack pressed against her ribs, trying to stay close enough to the building to feel the heat that escaped under the door, but far enough not to be struck by the soldiers moving crates into the motor pool. A middle-aged couple hurried past her, clutching their own ration sacks and shelter slips, and the wife whispered that they could not take anyone with them, because regulations said each shelter had a maximum number of bodies per square meter to prevent suffocation if dust or smoke entered during a strike. For the woman on the ramp, the rule meant she did not simply lack a shelter. She lacked a sponsor, which was the wartime word for someone willing to attach their name to hers on a list. Shelter sponsors were rare in winter because food was short, blankets were few, and even one extra person could turn a family's careful planning upside down. The siren continued its test cycle, long and sharp, and though no aircraft were overhead, no one trusted alerts in that district after the bakery had been hit 2 months earlier without warning. The woman looked across the street toward the clinic where patients lined the hallways, waiting for injections of vitamin oil and fever medicine. The clinic had a basement shelter too, but it was registered under medical jurisdiction, and without a hospital card, she could not cross the threshold. She tried walking toward the alley where some civilians had fled, hoping that maybe an empty stairwell or storage room could keep out the wind long enough for the siren to stop. But the alley was blocked by a sign that read, "Private Shelter, Full," in 3 languages, with an arrow pointing to a locked iron gate. There was no hatred in the sign, no shouting, and no insults. Only a rule that cared nothing for people who did not fit into its categories. When she returned to the depot ramp, she placed her ration sack on the ground and wrapped her coat tighter around her chest to conserve heat. The officer inside the depot shouted again through the door that she had to clear the yard so they could lock the gate. But before she could decide, a soldier pulled the gate shut from the inside and the padlock snapped into place. Civilians still on the street hurried toward the old bank vault, half a block down, because someone said the vault had been cleared for shelter use weeks before. But by the time the woman reached the front steps, a soldier posted at the door announced that the vault was closed for capacity reasons and would not take more bodies. People squeezed through anyway, and someone fell on the steps as the soldier yelled for order. Seeing no opening, the woman stepped aside to avoid being shoved down the stairs and watched the line coil around the building, listening to the siren and the dull echo of metal shutters slamming closed. In that moment, it became clear that she was not being hated or pointed at like the women who were called traitors in other towns. She was being forgotten, which was a quieter humiliation, but no less dangerous in winter, when the sky might decide to send real planes instead of tests. The siren wailed again, longer this time, and still she had no place to go and no one to write her name on a roster that would allow her to stay alive inside concrete walls instead of out in the open, looking for permission that never came. The woman remained near the depot ramp as the street emptied into shelters one doorway at a time, and it happened with a kind of quiet speed that came from habit rather than panic. People in the town had learned after months of alerts that survival depended on moving quickly when sirens sounded, and not stopping to negotiate with anyone who did not have a shelter card, because shelter cards protected families. And without a card, a person became an extra body that rules could not account for. A mother carrying a bundle of blankets pulled her 2 children toward the vault steps without looking left or right, and the children asked no questions. Even they knew that asking questions took time, and time was not a luxury during alerts. A baker from the next street over pushed his flour cart through a different door marked "Authorized Storage," and when the woman tried to follow him inside, he blocked the way and said in a low voice that only workers with storage papers could enter, not because he disliked her, but because the officer who checked inventory would fine him for letting unlisted civilians into the supply room. The woman stepped back again, holding her ration sack close to her chest, as if weight could make her less visible. On the pavement beside the depot wall sat an elderly man with a cane who had arrived too late for distribution and too slowly for shelter. He tapped his cane in frustration, but did not ask for help, because asking meant obligating someone, and obligation during wartime could upset fragile household arrangements. A teenage boy stood near a barrel for a moment, chewing a piece of stale bread before slipping into the sewer stairwell, where workers sometimes waited out alerts without heat or blankets. The woman considered following him, but hesitated, because that stairwell sometimes filled with drain water after heavy snow melts. And once during winter, A child had been carried out, soaked and coughing for hours. As the siren kept its rising and falling pattern, a soldier in an American jacket shouted that the test could become a real alert at any moment, because the district control room had not given the everything clear yet. At that announcement, the last of the civilians scattered into doorways, leaving the woman and the elderly man on the street with the wind blowing bits of torn posters across the cobblestones. The depot officer opened the shutter at eye level for a brief moment to check the outside conditions, and when he saw civilians still lingering on the ramp, he shouted that the gate was locked and that they had to clear the yard for ordnance check, which was the depot's way of saying that the motor pool needed open space in case trucks had to move. The woman did not argue. She picked up her ration sack and stepped off the ramp, stopping near the supply truck bay where soldiers had piled crates of canned milk and powdered soup for hospital delivery. One of the local civilians hurried past her carrying a large pot and muttered that nobody could help strangers now because every shelter had a strict head count, and breaking head count could get a family removed from the district assistance list. The words did not carry hostility, just resignation. The woman looked again at the sky, at the buildings, at the closed doors, and at the padlocked vault entrance, and realized that she was not being punished for disloyalty or accused of aiding the enemy. She was being treated as someone without category, and in a town governed by ration slips, billets, shelter rosters, and hospital cards. Having no category meant having no place to stand when the siren howled through the winter air and turned everyone into arithmetic instead of neighbors. The siren did not stop, and that kept everyone tense because in that winter of the war, even a test could turn into a real alert without warning. And the control room often changed signals if pilots reported enemy aircraft passing too close to the district boundaries. The depot shutters shook each time the wind pushed against them, and soldiers inside shouted instructions to lock down the staircases and seal the vents so smoke or dust would not travel into the basement if the building took damage. The woman watched the officers adjust the wooden bars over the windows and heard them read names off the roster to make sure no one inside had slipped out or been left behind during the distribution, because losing track of bodies on a roster could result in reports that the shelter had failed to follow protocols. Further down the street, someone yelled for children to hurry, and an older woman banged on the vault door demanding to be let in. But after a few moments, the soldier stationed there lowered his voice and told her she was not on the list, and she needed to move to her assigned shelter before curfew, which was impossible because she carried no papers and had no address. She backed away, holding her casserole dish to her chest, unsure where to stand next. The air alert signal continued its rising wail, and each cycle made the town feel smaller, as if every doorway had become a gatekeeper between survival and exposure. The woman with the ration sack turned toward the end of the depot yard where the motor pool was located, and she saw soldiers rolling canvas tarps over supply trucks to protect the cargo from ice and debris. The civilians tried to ask the soldiers if the alert was real or just part of the test system, but the soldiers ignored the questions because only the control room could confirm alerts, and soldiers had no authority to make promises during uncertain signals. A young nurse emerged from the clinic carrying a clipboard, calling for any civilians with hospital cards to come to the back courtyard, because the clinic's basement shelter had been cleared for medical dependency, which meant it was allowed to take patients and caretakers, but not unregistered civilians. The woman stepped forward, hopeful that maybe she could slip in behind the patients, but a hospital orderly blocked her path and asked for her card without emotion. When she said she had none, he simply said, "I'm sorry," and pointed her back toward the street. There was no insult in his voice, no accusation, and no attempt to embarrass her. He was enforcing rules that kept the clinic from being overrun and losing authorization from the district supervisor. The woman moved back to the side of the depot building and pressed her back against the cold brick, trying to make herself smaller, as two men hurried past carrying sacks of coal to feed the stoves inside. A wagon rolled down the cobblestones, pulled by a tired horse, and the driver shouted that the factory shelter near the bridge had taken its last people and had shut the doors. Civilians listening to the driver went silent for a moment, because every closed shelter reduced the number of places left to hide. When the siren switched to a sharper pitch, one that some locals believed signaled a real incoming threat, the tension in the street changed again. People no longer thought about courtesy or waiting or helping. They thought only about whether there was still time to reach a building with thick walls and a roster sheet that could prove they had existed before the alert began. The woman gripped her ration sack, stared at the locked depot gate, and understood with painful clarity that she had no building, no card, no sponsor, and no status, and without any of those, she was not part of the town's survival plan. She was simply outside, while the war tested the doors. Inside the motor pool, an American supply platoon had been checking crates for the evening convoy to the hospital. And among them was a corporal in a dust-colored jacket who had been marking inventory with chalk on wooden boards. He paused when he noticed the woman standing against the depot wall, holding her ration sack tightly, while the rest of the street emptied into basements and shelters. At first, he assumed she was waiting for someone to come out, but the longer he watched, the clearer it became that she was not waiting. She was stranded. Most soldiers had already seen this pattern in other districts by that point in the war. Civilians who had lost their homes, or landlords had no shelter sponsorship, and therefore no legal place to enter during alerts. To the corporal, there was nothing dramatic or suspicious about her. She carried a ration sack, not maps or radios, and her coat was patched in the elbows and sleeves in a way that said she had lived through shortages rather than schemes. He watched her look at the vault door, then the clinic, then the depot shutter, as if she were testing every possible place to stand before the siren changed tones again. The corporal looked around the motor pool and saw that the last of the crates had been stacked and the drivers were sitting inside the trucks, warming their hands over tin cups. He also noticed that no civilians were left in the yard, except the elderly man with the cane and the woman with the ration sack. The corporal asked a depot orderly at the door why they were outside, and the orderly answered in a tired voice that the woman had no papers and no sponsor, and therefore could not enter any registered shelter, and that taking her in without her name on a list could cause trouble with district supervisors. The orderly did not sound cruel. He sounded resigned, the way people sound when they want to help but fear the rules more than they fear being unkind. The corporal nodded and stepped away from the doorway to think. Soldiers were taught to solve logistical problems, and to him this was a logistical problem. A civilian without paperwork during an alert. If the alert turned real and the depot took damage, she would be outside without protection and would likely be listed as an unregistered casualty, a phrase he had seen too many times in paperwork from other towns. He looked up at the sky, then toward the road outside the depot fence, noting that the district patrol was sweeping the street and telling late civilians to get underground or move to their assigned buildings. The woman had no assigned building. The corporal moved toward the supply truck, grabbed his clipboard, and checked the platoon shelter roster. It had empty spaces, because not every driver stayed during alerts. Some were already at the hospital depot, waiting for the convoy. Empty spaces meant unused shelter capacity, and unused capacity meant there was room for at least one person who did not belong to any list. He knew from experience that shelter rules were strict at the entrance but sometimes flexible inside, as long as the paperwork looked official enough for the next shift. He also knew that the woman had no time left to negotiate for a card or argue with a doorway. The siren changed pitch again, shorter and sharper, and several soldiers nearby glanced up at the sky. After a brief moment of hesitation, the corporal made his decision. He set down the clipboard, straightened his jacket, and walked out toward the woman on the ramp, ready to speak, not as someone offering pity, but as someone offering category. Because in that winter, Category was the difference between being inside and being left on the street. The corporal walked toward the woman with steady steps, not running or shouting because rushing would have drawn attention from depot officers who might block him out of procedure. And procedure mattered more than emotion in that winter of shelter rosters and ration slips. When he reached the loading ramp, he asked her in plain language if she had a shelter card. She shook her head once, still clutching her ration sack as if it were the only proof she existed in the system. The corporal did not ask for explanations about her landlord or her address, because explanations were useless without paperwork, and what she lacked was not story but status. He told her to follow him and move toward the motor pool entrance. At the doorway, a depot orderly held up his hand to stop them and pointed at a sign that listed the authorized categories: drivers, medical transport, and supply. Civilians with no category were not meant to pass. The corporal took a piece of chalk from his jacket pocket and wrote a brief mark on her ration slip. 2 letters that indicated someone from supply had taken responsibility for her movement. The chalk mark was not official law, but it was a common field workaround in districts where paperwork could not be issued fast enough to match the needs of civilians. The orderly hesitated, reading the chalk mark like someone trying to understand a new dialect of rule, then lowered his hand and let them pass into the motor pool. Inside, the air was warmer, filled with the smell of diesel and boiled potatoes from a pot near the stove. The soldiers sat on crates, tightening bootlaces and adjusting gloves, preparing to shelter in place until the all clear. The corporal guided the woman toward the back corner of the motor pool, where a ladder led to a cellar. He opened the hatch and pointed downward, explaining that the cellar had been converted into a shelter for the supply platoon and could hold more bodies than the official roster listed because part of the room extended under the depot office. She climbed down the ladder carefully, ration sack pressed to her chest, and found herself in a long basement room where blankets had been rolled out in rows, and a stove glowed in the corner. Several civilians were already inside, including nurses from the clinic and 2 men who carried parcels for the hospital. No one stared at her or asked if she had a sponsor, but because shelter culture did not work that way. Once inside, the only question that mattered was whether she had space on the floor and enough air to breathe. The corporal descended after her, closed the hatch, and walked to the small desk where a field clerk sat with a half-filled roster sheet. The clerk looked up, saw the woman, and raised his eyebrows, waiting for a classification. The corporal tapped the chalk mark on her ration slip and said, "Supply shelter, temporary entry." The clerk wrote her name onto the list without debate and stamped the sheet with the platoon seal. With that stamp, she was no longer a stray civilian. She was now part of a shelter headcount. The corporal handed the ration slip back to her and pointed to an open blanket space near the stove. She sat down and held her ration sack in her lap, unsure whether to relax or remain braced for someone to tell her she did not belong. But no one spoke to her in that way. A nurse poured water into tin cups and passed them around, and when she reached the woman, she checked the chalk mark long enough to confirm category and moved on without comment. The corporal sat near the ladder, listening for changes in the siren patterns, and the cellar settled into a waiting silence, the kind that belonged not to comfort, but to survival. While the war continued overhead and the documents on the desk proved she existed inside the rules again. The cellar shelter slowly filled with the muted noises of people adjusting their blankets, sipping from tin cups, and counting how much food they had left for the next day's queue. And for the first time since the depot officer had shut the door in her face, the woman was no longer exposed to the winter wind or the judgment of passers-by. She was simply one more civilian waiting for the siren to change. The stove crackled as someone fed it small pieces of firewood, and against the far wall, a group of nurses whispered about the latest shortage of vitamin oil at the clinic, discussing how the medical staff had begun dividing doses into thirds to make them last 2 additional weeks. The woman listened without interrupting, learning through their talk that shortages had not just affected people like her on the outside, but had reached into the clinics and hospitals as well, proving that categories did not always bring comfort. Some categories just brought different burdens. The corporal checked the cellar's head count with the field clerk, confirming that the space still fell within acceptable limits for ventilation. He pointed out that 2 of the drivers were still at the hospital depot and would not arrive until after the alert, leaving unused capacity that could legally accommodate 1 or 2 displaced civilians. The clerk nodded and adjusted the numbers on his sheet. The woman sat quietly near the stove, absorbing the warmth that slowly reached her fingers through her patched gloves. No one asked her to justify her presence or explain why she had no shelter card. The chalk mark on her ration slip and the clerk's stamp had answered those questions for her. A soldier near the ladder began humming quietly, and though no one joined him, the sound softened the room's tension. The siren continued for several long minutes, and then abruptly switched to a steady tone, the signal that the control room was reviewing the skies. Everyone in the cellar paused mid-motion and tilted their heads to listen, because a steady tone could mean 2 things. Either an aircraft-sighted report had been confirmed, or the test was about to end. The difference mattered. After a few seconds, footsteps thumped overhead and the hatch opened. The corporal climbed the ladder, spoke briefly to someone on the depot floor, and then returned to announce that the signal was part of extended testing and that the district had not reported incoming aircraft. The soldiers exhaled, and people resumed drinking, eating, or whispering. The woman unfolded her ration sack and took out a small piece of bread she had saved from the depot earlier, biting it slowly so it would last. The nurse across from her saw the bread and offered a tiny pinch of salt from a ration tin, a gesture that in peacetime would have meant almost nothing. But in winter, wartime felt like hospitality. The woman accepted the salt and nodded her thanks. When the all clear finally sounded, a short burst followed by silence, the corporal told the civilians to remain seated until the street sweep was completed. Because patrols sometimes checked for stragglers after alerts to make sure no one was injured or trapped outside. When word came back that the sweep was done, the corporal unlocked the hatch and guided the civilians out, 1 ladder at a time. The woman climbed last, stepping into the motor pool where the trucks were already warming for the hospital convoy. As she followed the others through the depot hallway toward the courtyard, her ration slip stamped with the platoon seal felt like a passport to a city she had been excluded from just an hour earlier. No one cheered, no one congratulated her, and no one called her a burden. The chalk mark and the stamp had spoken for her where explanations had failed. When the civilians exited the motor pool into the depot courtyard, the woman remained near the wall, while the nurses and the parcel carriers gathered around a field clerk who had spread papers across a crate to process updated billets for those who had sheltered during the alert. The corporal pointed toward the desk and told her quietly, "Go to the clerk," in the same tone soldiers used for giving directions on the road or in a convoy yard. Practical, not gentle, and not sentimental. The clerk looked up as she approached, inspecting her ration slip and scanning the chalk mark with practiced eyes. In wartime, chalk could function as authorization if the right person had written it. He stamped her ration slip again, but this time with an official billet stamp instead of a platoon seal. The stamp meant she was granted temporary shelter status, valid for 7 nights, and it gave her permission to sleep in an assigned space, under the depot, rather than on the street or inside a stairwell. When the clerk slid a billet card across the crate, she hesitated before taking it, not because she doubted it was real, but because she had not been handed anything with a stamp since before her landlord had been relocated, and stamps were how the war acknowledged people. The corporal stepped aside to let her finish the process on her own, because dignity required that civilians speak to clerks for themselves when the situation was no longer dangerous. The clerk explained that her billet granted access to morning soup at the depot kitchen, evening bread at the soup line, and shelter for the week during alerts. He also added her name to the report that would be forwarded to the district office, listing her as a displaced civilian under shelter reassignment, which meant she had been entered into the system properly rather than left to wander without category. A nurse checked her coat for warmth and told the clerk that the woman should be issued a blanket from the depot storage room. The corporal signed the requisition slip so the blanket could be released without extra paperwork. A few minutes later, the woman held a folded blanket in her arms and felt its weight like something more substantial than cloth. As the convoy trucks rolled out of the motor pool toward the hospital, the corporal glanced at her billet card one last time, confirming that it contained all the necessary stamps. He did not give her instructions beyond practical details. He simply told her where the basement dormitory entrance was located and where to queue for soup at dawn. Then he returned to his tasks, shouting to the drivers about fuel levels and delivery times. The woman walked to the basement entrance and showed her billet card to the depot watchman. He checked the stamp and waved her through without suspicion or delay. Inside, the basement had been arranged with rows of blankets and crates for personal belongings. A few displaced civilians were already lying down with their coats folded under their heads as makeshift pillows. The woman placed her ration sack beneath her crate, set the folded blanket on the floor, and lowered herself onto it slowly, unsure if her body remembered how to rest indoors. There were no speeches, no apologies from the depot staff, and no civilians debating whether she deserved to be there. The stamp had answered those questions in the only language the war still respected: procedure. The basement dormitory settled into a kind of organized silence as the evening lamps dimmed, and the woman lay under her new blanket while the depot workers performed their night routine, counting bodies, checking names against billet cards, and making sure no one was sleeping too close to the stove where sparks from the wood could jump. The clerk wrote her name onto the roster sheet in calm strokes, then pinned the sheet to a board near the door so the next shift could verify headcounts without waking anyone. For the woman, the act of being counted was not a correction of some earlier injustice or an act of charity. It was simply the first time since her landlord had been relocated that her existence had been recorded by someone with authority, instead of ignored by doorways that required paperwork she did not have. When morning came, while soldiers in the motor pool banged crates shut and shouted instructions for the hospital convoy that would leave at sunrise, and the depot kitchen opened long enough to serve a ladle of thin soup and a chunk of bread to everyone with billet authorization. The woman queued quietly with her ration slip and billet card, and when she reached the front, the cook read the stamps and poured soup into her tin without hesitation. No one asked where she had slept last week, and no one asked if someone else was supposed to be sponsoring her. The stamp had replaced suspicion with procedure. After breakfast, billets were checked again, and civilians with valid cards were allowed to exit through the courtyard to find work, medical appointments, or relatives in other shelters. The woman walked out into the cold morning air and noticed that the depot yard looked different than it had the day before, not because the buildings had changed, but because she was no longer standing outside a locked door, wondering if anyone would let her in. She followed the sound of footsteps to the soup line on the next street, where displaced civilians waited for lunch, and the workers there also checked stamps before serving. As trucks rolled down the main road toward the river crossing, the corporal passed by with his clipboard. He did not stop to speak to her or look for thanks. He glanced at the depot bulletin board, checked the convoy logs, and shouted for the drivers to move out. The woman watched the convoy turn the corner and felt no need for speeches or dramatic meaning. The shelter billet had not made her safe from the war, and nor had it promised that future sirens would end without danger. It had simply placed her inside the city's system instead of outside its doors. And in that winter, with so many people missing, relocated, or unregistered, belonging to any system at all meant surviving another day. She kept walking until she reached the courtyard where civilians lined up to collect medical oil for children, and no one called her homeless or unwanted or extra. She had a blanket, a billet, a ration slip, and a place to queue. And the war continued beyond the rooftops with no intention of stopping for anyone's dignity or pain. But dignity did not require the war to stop. It only required that someone recognize a person as more than a problem to be moved aside. And on that cold morning at the ration depot, someone finally had.